Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Dark and Stormy Nights. This is Loki.
And this is Deer.
And I've got a chapter for you this week. Now, I do want to make some excuses. Okay, this was a rough week for me. Well, actually, it's been a rough couple of weeks for me. Mm-hmm. There's been so much going on, I could barely find any time to write, so I apologize. This is not my best work.
It happens.
So I did what I could in what little time I had with what little sanity I had left. So... But, okay, so this chapter is about our antagonist. Right? So our antagonist has a little plan that she plans to exact. However, she's kind of recalling history. A lot of it is her remembering the past.
Okay.
Okay?
Cool.
So hopefully this will clear up a few things and add well to our story. Hopefully this worked well. I'm not sure if it did or not, but...
Well, I mean, it's the rough draft. If there's any issues, we can always build it out a little bit.
Well, yeah, it'll definitely need cleaned up a little bit, and it'll probably need built out a little bit, but I think it's a good start, maybe. I don't know.
Okay,
all right,
good.
You ready?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. The murdered-out muscle car tore down the highway with the power and intensity of an entire herd of wild horses running as one across the American plains. The engine roared with a fury almost as great as what burned in Annalise's heart. Annalise's large, muscular body filled the front seat to capacity, just barely affording her the comfort in the front of the hot rod. Yeah, I don't like the way that sounds. Her hands gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckle heat. Annalise chose not to wear the charm mandated by the Combine, and she didn't seem to care that all could see her true form. Fomorian are not usually the most attractive beings. Unseelie, dark fae, the unholy, the unblessed, the dark ones, they are creatures of the night for a reason. Annalise was lucky, however. Her half-human heritage contributed to her looks. Though large and fit, she had a beauty about her that made it easy to overlook her inhuman features, like her canine teeth, pale complexion, and pointed ears. Annalise turned her attention to the duffel bag of corpses a moment, and back to the road. She allowed her memory to drift into a daydream about how this all started. Annalise vividly recalled that day in 1647 when she saw it all begin. Before she knew what she was witnessing, she remembered her caretaker, who she knew as Mum, walking her to the market in Hartford, Connecticut each day. Annalise remembered the sudden changes in her town that summer. First, strange men began to arrive in town. In the following days, Annalise noticed these men talking to many of the townsfolk. She remembers they spoke in voices not their own, sometimes the voice of a woman or a child, but never in voices that would fit what they looked like. Annalise remembered seeing magic about these strange new folk, but not understanding what it was. A few days after the arrival of the strange folk, a group of townsfolk exited the church and began rounding up women. First on that day, Elsie Young, the wife of a carpenter who had moved to Connecticut from England. No good explanation as to why people felt she was a witch was even given. The trial was swift and unjust. She was hanged publicly. From then on, Mum took Annalise to all the trials. Annalise watched as innocent men and women were rounded up for trivial infractions, which somehow qualified them for being witches. Ironically, Annalise knew these women possessed the power. However, none of them were a threat to anyone. Annalise watched as they took Mary Johnson for no other reason but dancing around a tree while drunk. A harsh puritanical system was levied against her. While her crime was trivial and ridiculous, her label was harsh in the eyes of religious fanatics who ran this court. Soon came Goody Ayers, a woman who offered childcare in the town, and then in the following days, one by one, other women of the town were accused and taken as well. Flyers were being hung about town advertising of the impending trial. Annalise remembered Mum speaking of how this is going to be a spectacle of a lifetime. Annalise was too young to understand. Mum brought her each day to the trial. Sure enough, it was a grand spectacle. Shouting and accusations spewed from the crowd at the women accused. The following days, people would bring half of rotten vegetables and a hail of rotten vegetables and rocks down upon them as the testimony heated up. On the third day, the court welcomed a young girl to testify. Annalise was confused as a gentleman who looked to be middle-aged walked out and sat in the witness box. Annalise squinted her eyes in hopes of seeing what she was missing. She stared as the man was asked his name, and he said, "Little Bethany Wilson." And then, his age? 9 years old. He was asked what had the witches done to her. The man spoke childlike about how the witches used their power of evil to control her. "What did the witches make you do, Bethany?" the prosecutor asked. The man who sat in the witness stand moved his hands in a pattern that Annalise recognized. The flutter of magic is plainly visible to her, a charm spell, which for a moment allowed Annalise to recognize not only what he was doing, but what he was. The man was casting a charm spell, which allowed Annalise to see the illusion as projected over the man, who was clearly a sorcerer in her opinion. The image was of a little blonde girl who began to cry. Annalise could hear the young girl's voice carried on the man's voice. Human minds are simple and easy to manipulate. She knew they could not see through the spell like she could. The women accused of being witches attempted to protest, calling out lies and yelling objections. They were quickly bound, gagged, and silenced. She watched in growing disdain as the man testified now obvious lies. The man described in detail how the witches forced her to kill animals and people to satisfy an evil spirit. She cried and stammered to garner sympathy. Annalise suspected the women accused knew his nature, but dared not speak up for fear it would only make their case worse. She watched the trial, growing more and more hateful of the man in the little girl illusion. When the trial ended for the day, Mum took her home. Annalise remembered festering the whole way home, waiting until they were in the privacy of their home before she burst into vocal outrage. Before Mum could set her sweater on the chair by the door, Annalise flew into a furious rant about what she had seen and how she was outraged by all the injustice of it all. Mum patiently listened as Annalise poured her outrage on her. She listened patiently as Annalise spelled out every injustice she believed she had witnessed, as though Mum was not there to see it herself. Once Annalise was done and exhausted from the raw emotion, she allowed herself to experience... Oh, sorry, I said that kind of wrong. Once Annalise was done and exhausted from the raw emotion she had allowed herself to experience, panting for failing to take breaths when she needed to, so that she could complete her thoughts. Instead, she looked at Mum, doe-eyed, and begged her, "What can I do?" She asked in the helpless despair of a powerless child. "How can I save them?" Mum thought a moment before speaking. She looked at Annalise, sad, put her hand on her head to comfort, and told her, "Nothing, child. There's nothing you can do to save these poor people. Not right now, anyways. Someday you can stop the horrors like this, but not today. Today I need to keep you safe. So one day you can grow and be strong, strong enough to fight for the innocent, strong enough to fight for the victims of injustice. But today I need to keep you safe until you can take your rightful place." "My rightful place?" Annalise questioned. "Yes, child. You are royalty, don't you know?" "My father never told me that we were royalty." "Your father isn't royalty. Your mother is." "I don't even know my real mother." "Your mother is a powerful member of a council known as the Combine. She is a ruling member of what is known as the Unseelie Court. The Combine is made up of 3 groups: sorcerers, witches, and the Fae. These 3 groups have equal votes on the council. Your mother has been a member of this court for over 100 years. Why can't we ask my mother for help to stop this? The Fae do not get involved in the affairs of humans. They only care for themselves. But when you are old enough to take your rightful place in the council, You can change that. Annalise was angry that her mother would not get involved. She was angry with her mother that she never came to see her, let alone that she wouldn't get involved. Tears welled up in her eyes as she remembered what it was like to grow up without her. She remembered how she would imagine confronting her when she was old enough. She imagined taking her place on the council from her... she remembered... She imagined taking her place on the council from her, only for that day to never come. Annalise and Mum returned to watch the closing arguments of the trial. The women accused of witchcraft were not permitted to speak. They had to sit there, gagged, as the prosecution stood and lied to the jury about them. They sat helpless, as the jury was told they had to convict because the devil could not be permitted to have a hold on Hartford, because we need to keep our souls clean and our children safe from witchcraft, and because the Bible specifically tells us that we cannot suffer a witch to live. It did not take long for the jury to deliberate. Less than 2 hours. Guilty, as if the verdict was ever going to be anything else. Never has there been a greater miscarriage of justice. These poor men and women never stood a chance. The deck was stacked against them. Annalise just kept thinking that had she known what she knows now, maybe she could have done something then. The accused were quickly taken to a holding area where they are kept for several days. Passers-by would hurl insults, rotten food, and sometimes rocks through the barred windows. Annalise remembered sneaking off to drop honey biscuits through the bars for the prisoners. Annalise remembered thinking they should have something nice before they died. We're going to pause there.
Okay, sounds good. I really like it, actually.
Really?
Yeah, I think that it paints the picture very well. I think that you definitely kind of, portray the injustice that she's witnessing and expose her frustration at the fact that she can't do anything about it. I think that it's really good. Yeah.
I accidentally shut off my microphone. It doesn't feel too out of the memory, does it? I mean, you still get she's remembering back to this feel.
Yeah, you definitely, I think that it was easy to follow that she's a child here.
Okay.
Talking to her mother and, yeah.
Well, her caretaker, but yeah.
Well, she calls her mom, so.
It's Mum.
Whatever.
Okay, take a little break, come back with the second half?
Yeah, sounds good.
Wonderful. We'll be back in a minute.
Why my drippings will go?
Because you were listening to the Dark and Stormy Nights podcast on iTunes, Google Play Music, or Podbean. Back to the Dark and Stormy Nights. This is Loki.
And this is Tyr.
And we're going to just jump right back in to the second half of this chapter. Let me just do this real quick. Okay. All right, you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready. Go for it.
On the day of their execution, the prisoners were brought out and lined up on a makeshift gallows. It was obvious that they had been beaten and tortured. Their bodies were so bruised and battered, it was likely that they welcomed death at this point. Annalise could not believe that anybody could be treated with such inhumanity. It was even more mind-boggling that the people responsible claimed to be the moral authority, while simultaneously being capable of such horrific inhumanity. 7 men and women were lined up here on this day in Hartford, Connecticut. 7 men and women were hanged as witches, with such trivial evidence as dancing around a tree while drunk. 11 total people died from the witch trials in this town, and now Annalise knew it was all because the Combine manipulated it to be so. The trials in Hartford ignited a blaze of witch hunts. Hundreds, maybe even thousands of men and women were accused and put to death. Some, but not all, received a trial, but in almost every case the trial was unjust and rigged against them. Many of the people who were actually witches never hurt a soul, and many more men and women who weren't even witches were caught up in the trials and killed over petty grievances in the name of God. Annalise recalled the memories of returning to Hartford once she was an adult. Things had changed so much, it took quite a bit of research to find where those accused of being witches were buried, as they were forbidden to have a proper grave. Once Annalise had found them, she set about sanctifying their graves. Only a couple had remained, as the grave sites had been desecrated by vandals, believing these people evil and undeserving of peace and death. On those graves Annalise could find, she planted the sacred seeds so that one day their kin could find them. Annalise remembered attending every witch trial she could in her adult life. She tried her best to unravel the lie, to uncover the responsible, and to save the accused without exposing herself as a fae. But she regretfully could never find a way. Annalise traveled to Fairfield, Connecticut in 1692, once the witch trials took off there. She helped as many witches escape as she could, but droves of religious fanatics, manipulated by sorcerers, patrolled the roads for those attempting to get away, and hung them or burned them alive without a trial. Often the sanctuary caravans drove escaping witches directly into the hands of bloodthirsty mobs. They seemed to know the witch underground's every move, strangely. The women who stood trial in Fairfield stood a better chance than those trying to escape. A mysterious figure made sure that they only spent the rest of their lives in prison instead of being executed. Only those trying to escape were killed. Annalise's regret for how her efforts backfired grew. So did her list. Annalise kept a list of the names of the witches who were lost, the locations of where they were buried, the descriptions and names, when possible, of those responsible. Annalise clutched the journal that cataloged the legacy of destruction. Annalise recalled Salem, 1693, when she tried again. She feared trying to help the witches escape again because of the carnage it caused last time. So this time she attempted to undo the magics of the sorcerers, only to have it backfire. The jury, believing it to be the work of the witches, the judgment was swift and harsh. Bridget Bishop, hanged at Gallows Hill, June 10th, 1692. Rebecca Nurse, hanged at Gallows Hill, June 19th, 1692. Sarah Good, hanged at Gallows Hill, July 19th, 1692. Elizabeth Howe, hanged at Gallows Hill, July 19th, 1692. Susanna Martin, hanged at Gallows Hill, July 19th, 1692. Sarah Wilds, hanged at Gallows Hill, July 19th, 1692. Giles Corey, pressed to death. Pressed. What a nice way to say they crushed the poor bastard to death. What a horrific and brutal way to go. Annalise remembered every one of their faces. Hell, she couldn't forget them. She could still see them hanging in her mind. She didn't think she could ever forget that sight. Tears streamed down Annalise's face as she drove, clouding her vision. Her rage intensified as old emotions washed over her. She remembered attending witch trial after witch trial, lynching after lynching, injustice after injustice. So much senseless bloodshed of innocent people, and it all began to blur together. The last trial Annalise attended was that of Nancy Evans in 1805 in the town of Bethel, Ohio. The sorcerers of the Combine promised the Hildebrand sisters fame and fortune if they could get Nancy Evans convicted, and those two monsters did everything they could to make sure it happened. Nancy Evans never stood a chance. She was the last witch as far as anybody knew, and the Combine was going to make damn sure she had no claim and no recourse. The trial of Nancy Evans was swift and devastating. The Hildebrands girls accused her of being a satanic witch and hexing them. No matter what Nancy said in her defense, it was not believed. Eventually, a witch's chair was constructed, and when Nancy sat in the chair, the Bible she was weighed against went flying off the chair. Nancy was a rather large woman. Being heavier than the Bible generally meant you were innocent, but the manner in which the Bible went flying was taken as an omen that Nancy herself was a witch and used witchcraft to displace the Bible. That night, a gallows was built and Nancy was hanged. Her body was buried in the garden behind her cottage, and for a long time it was forbidden to sell the property. It was the easiest to find of all the bodies Annalise recovered. The last of her grim memories spent, Annalise's thoughts returned to the world of the present. Leaving the freeway, she drove cautiously to the graveyard, where the scheme all started. A dark figure awaited her beyond a row of mausoleums, backlit by a street light on the other side of the gate. She turned off the headlights and slowly crept to the back of the cemetery where she met her twisted black minion. "Are we ready?" Annalise inquired quietly from the driver's seat of the car. The twisted black figure just gurgled and shook. Good, I hate to be kept waiting. Annalise threw the car in park, shut it off. She snatched the bag out of the passenger seat, opened the door, and stepped out into the night. The Bodak dragged a leg behind him as it made its way to the ritual area. A large, complex geometric seal covered the ground for about 30 feet, crossing several graves, with one grave in particular in the center. The lines of the seal converged on this grave, an offering of cigars and rum atop the headstone that read Orisha Exu, keeper of the crossroads. Annalise placed the three corpses in separate circles inlaid in the knotwork of the complex seal. She then opens the rum and pours a glass, lights a cigar, and takes a puff, careful not to inhale, and then balances it on the rim of the glass of rum. The Bodak drags himself to the center of the seal and begins to make rhythmic, gurgling noises. Cracks form in his skin and begin to glow a dim orange red. A moment later, the candles placed at strategic points on the seal spontaneously ignite. Annalise begins a low chant in some long-forgotten language. A chicken in a cage to the side begins to cluck as if knowing its time in this world is nearing an end. Annalise pulls the chicken from the cage, chanted some words in time with the Bodak's gurgling, and then cut the chicken's throat over the headstone. As this blood spilled out upon the headstone, the lines of the seal began to glow. Beams of light began to pierce the ground from underneath Orisha Exu's grave, and a low rumble could be felt from under the ground. Annalise looked over to the Bodak. "He is with us," she proclaimed as the wind started to pick up. The smoke from the cigar began to billow and whip around until an ethereal form manifested with a subtle glow. The rum evaporated into thin air, and the chickens withered to ash. The form split into three identical forms and hovered over the witches that were laid in the seal. Smoke and dust flowed between the corpses and the spectral forms that hovered above them. Annalise watched intently as the ritual played out before her. She was suddenly startled as Orisha Exu coalesced in a singular form in front of her. Its pale, painted face squinted as if to peer through her soul. It spoke in its native language, which Annalise learned just for this. "We have agreed to bring back those who were wronged as you wish, but they are not as your soul remembers, child. Be warned." And then he dissolved into the night. The candles died down to normal flickering flames. The lines of the seals went dim along with the cracks in the Bodak's skin. The cigar, just a butt now, continued to puff a faint trail of smoke, and the graveyard dimmed to the ambient light of the night. All was quiet but a soft breeze and an animal groaning in the distance, punctuated by the sound of an occasional passing car. Annalise stood waiting, listening, looking for something to happen. After a few minutes, she looked around in confusion. "What the fuck?" she began to express in frustration as the desiccated corpses of the witches she had retrieved began to rock and crack. Chunks of the hardened flesh began to fall away like eggshell from a hatching bird, until all of the dead shells had fallen away, leaving three ghastly glowing bodies laying before her in some sort of slumber. A smile fell across her face as she looked to the Bodak. "Command them," she demanded. The Bodak stretched his twisted form and unleashed its power. Ribbons of energy struck each of the witches' forms. The Bodak lifted its arms into the sky as if to command them to rise. He was surprised when it did little more than cause them to stir. The Bodak regrouped a moment and then tried again. The dark energy spilled from him in greater volume this time. Purple light illuminated the graveyard as the Bodak's energy engulfed the witches' sleeping forms. The Bodak forced its arms into the sky, commanding the witches to rise. The sudden surge of energy coursed through the supernatural forms. Their eyes shot open, and the three forms rose to the sky. Annalise felt drunk with power as she watched the three witches look down at her and the Bodak. "Welcome back, my friends," she shouted to the sky. The Bodak forced its will through the ribbons of power that connected him to the witches in an attempt to command them. This action only seemed to enrage them. One witch clenched its astral form, sending a surge of energy back through the ribbons, causing the Bodak to be thrown off of his feet and across the graveyard. The look on Annalise's face turned from one of pleasure to one of fear. I have brought you back so we could Seek vengeance on the Combine together, my sisters. The three looked angrily at Annalise. No, they said in a deep, wispy reverberation. The three witches let out a moaning howl as they joined as one and exploded into a wave of blue ethereal energy and disappeared. Annalise looked around herself, confused and angry. In the distance, she could see jets of blue light strobe in the horizon in every direction. She struggled to understand what it meant as she searched for the Bodak. Okay.
Okay. So I really think that this was one of your best chapters for all of your excuses in the beginning here.
I really didn't think it was.
I really like this one. There are, I think, maybe two things that I feel could use a little bit of tweaking.
Sure.
One, and it's not your fault at all, because I don't think we plotted it this way. Like, I think we mentioned it as like an aside.
Mm-hmm.
But seeing how deep you went into her backstory and her growing up and everything, I really feel that we kind of need to touch on the Fae side of the Combine also being decimated.
Yeah.
Because you're going from childhood through adult, and at some point in here, because she is Fae, I feel like she's going to... that's going to be a big factor for her. So, like, maybe making Fae also some of the victims of the witch trial.
Right, they get wrapped up in it.
Yes, because they're both a threat to the Combine, and the Combine is the one who is
Right.
facilitating this. So I think that, yeah, like, maybe because you're talking about, like, as she's a child and her mom is saying there's nothing you can do, you know, you have to grow up, you can't get wrapped up in this, and then by the time she's an adult, I think that at that point she needs to recognize that, you know, the witch and Fae representation on the Combine has dwindled, and now she's starting to see Fae involved in these trials, and their numbers are just dwindling as a population.
Right.
And she's like, I can't sit by anymore. I have to do something.
And I was thinking maybe we make mention that she goes to seek her place in the council, and there's nobody to talk to. There's nobody there.
Right.
There's no way to contact them. There's nothing.
Okay.
You know, maybe one time there was a way through the Fae connections in this
or maybe
world.
she doesn't even know what happened to her
but,
mother.
But yet there's no way to even contact the Fae here anymore. You know,
Okay.
or something. You know,
So, like, some got wrapped up in the trials and the rest just picked up and
they disappeared. Maybe
Yeah.
went home to save their own skin,
or were shoved back through.
or were killed, or anything. Yeah,
Mhm.
But they're gone. The Fae
And
present
I
here.
believe, like, according to Fae lore, they can banish, I believe, to where you can't pass through the portal anymore. But I
Yeah.
don't know if it works both ways. So maybe the sorcerers found some way to banish them so that they couldn't come through.
To shut the gate.
And she's, yeah.
Yeah, but why would it be
Not
open now is the only
necessarily-
thing I wonder.
No. Not necessarily shut the gate, but make it to where they can't pass. That particular Fae can't
Oh,
pass through
I
the
got
gate.
you. Like revoke their passport.
Right, exactly. I don't know. I've seen that in some lore. So anyway, yeah, I just think that because she's Fae, we need to touch on that a little bit more, and that should be pretty easy to work in there.
Right, right.
And then the other thing was just in the end where the witches are not obeying her command, which I think that's absolutely what they would do, as opposed to just a no. I think that we should explain a little bit. You don't necessarily need it to make it to where the witches are staying around to argue with her, but maybe making snide comments to themselves about her audacity to try to command them, you know, that kind of thing.
Right.
So
Who is
just-
this arrogant flea or something like that?
Yeah, exactly. Like, because to them, you know, for her and the Bodak to try to rule over them is just offensive.
Right, right.
So yeah, I think that just a couple of snide comments in there where they're going back and forth of like, who the hell do you think you are, you know?
Right, yeah.
And then other than that, I really liked it. I liked it definitely painted the picture very
So,
well.
of course, there's a lot of fiction in here, you know, but the names are real. And
Yeah, I know.
for the most part, the dates are real.
Yeah.
But
I recognized them, yeah.
Yeah, I did interject some other, you know, like, there's no evidence necessarily. There's actually a lot of the witch trials were erased. Like, we don't actually know a lot of the facts. The stuff on the last one in Bethel, there's no records of what actually happened. There's a couple different stories, and I kind of took from one of the stories as possibly what happened, but we don't actually know.
Yeah.
We do know she was buried in her yard. That I do know. So that was taken from fact. But the witch's chair may or may not have happened. We don't know.
Right.
They were embarrassed by what they had done, and they covered it up.
Well, they should be.
So,
Murdering people is generally frowned upon.
The Church of England still fails to recognize what they did, but at the same time won't pardon those that they tried.
Won't pardon the. They
So-
won't pardon the witches.
Right. Even though now we know there's no such thing as witches or what have you, you know.
Well, to
the
that
women they
extent.
killed, they won't say, you know, that these people are pardoned after
Yeah,
death.
the church has the general stance of not admitting that they were
Right.
wrong.
We were never wrong.
Right.
You were, but
Right.
okay.
The earth is still flat. Anyway, so yeah, but I just think that adding those couple of things would round out the story.
Okay.
But otherwise, I think it was great.
Cool. All right. Anything else?
No, I think that's good for today.
Wonderful. We'll see you next week where we're going to plan the following episode.
Yep. Sounds good.